Hi, Ma'am Kelly.
Hello. Sorry, I had an internet problem, so I'm using my mobile data at the moment. You're in luck. We're in luck. Of all the times that it's gonna be crappy, it's today.
We hope we could reach you. Anyway.
Yes.
I think we could start now. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. We're good.
Okay. So, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this afternoon's digital dialogue session. As a background, the digital dialogues with the theme Researching in the Social Sciences is a semester-long webinar series in celebration of the 60th founding anniversary of UP Baguio, with the theme UP Baguio at 60, Transformations, Formations, Transformations. The series recognizes that research is fundamental in the academic training of BA Social Science, BS Management, Economics, and graduate students in UP Baguio. Most, if not all, courses in the BAS, BSME, SDS, and MM curriculum is oriented with the importance of developing in students the values of meaningful research, engagement, such as intellectual honesty, inquisitiveness, rigor, comprehensiveness, coherence, and clarity in purpose, aims, and structure. The series aims to encourage students to do excellent social, scientific, and philosophical research by organizing lectures in the digital dialogue format. Senior faculty members, in conversation with younger faculty members, will talk about their latest publications and/or previous researches on their areas of specialization. So the digital dialogue format seeks to complement the classroom by not only aiming at discussing the research proper, but also other factors affecting the research process. The series of the digital dialogues also seeks to encourage research in areas which need further work. Now, the theme or topic of this afternoon's digital dialogue is epistemic injustice, which is a topic in philosophy, specifically in social epistemology and social philosophy. By the way, I am Vlad Bumatay, Assistant Professor of Philosophy from the Department of History and Philosophy, and I am your host as well as the other person in this afternoon's digital dialogue or conversation. So without further ado, let me therefore introduce the other person who will complete this afternoon's digital dialogue. She is an assistant professor of philosophy from the Department of History and Philosophy, College of Social Sciences. She is currently taking her PhD in philosophy in University College Dublin, Republic of Ireland, writing her dissertation on the topic Philosophy, the Philosophical Institution, and Epistemic Paralysis. She also has a master's degree in philosophy from the Royal and Pontifical University of Santo Tomas, graduating magna cum laude with a thesis entitled The Return of Philosophy in the Contemporary World, Alain Badiou and the Philosophy of the Event. I am not overstating when I say that she is a prolific scholar, serving as our model and inspiration in the discipline of philosophy. Her most recent publications include Epistemic Injustice, Epistemic Paralysis, and Epistemic Resistance, a feminist liberatory approach to epistemology. Another one is Ontology or Ethics, the case of Martin Heidegger and Watsuji Tetsuro. She also published the work entitled The Naturalized and Dialectical Ontologies of Nietzsche and Nishida, and of course, her work, which is a product or result of her MA thesis, The Event Divides into Two, or the Parallax of Change, Badiou, Zizek, Bostills, and Johnson. She has maintained this excellent publishing record on top of her involvement in various administrative positions in the university and outside the university. The most recent of which is her chief editorship of Perspectives, the International Postgraduate Journal of Philosophy, based in University College Dublin. But personally speaking, however, her greatest contribution to philosophy are not her excellent works, but her being itself as a philosopher, the kind of philosopher that she is. One that deeply and genuinely cares about people and the society. This belief of mine has been reaffirmed again just this morning when she asked me to address her in this dialogue merely as Kelly, without the ma'am. To micro-dismantle the asymmetry of power relation in the conversation, according to her. Her philosophy and her being has touched my heart, as I'm sure everyone who has known or has been with her has been with her. All the way from the land of beers and leprechauns, let us welcome Professor Kelly Louise Rexy Piaga.
Thank you so much, Vlad. That's a very humbling and touching introduction.
Good morning, ma'am. I know that it's morning there, right?
Yeah, good afternoon to you.
Yeah. So let us dive in immediately to the topic of our digital dialogue this afternoon, which is the topic of epistemic injustice, right? Which is actually a concept that you are developing or you're coming from in your dissertation. So as a way of introduction, therefore, or to introduce our participants to the topic of epistemic injustice, can you briefly explain to us your current research, or specifically your dissertation problem, which talks about epistemic injustice?
Yeah, I suppose the best way to introduce it is to maybe identify the basic ideas in not so philosophical language so that our audience can understand. So in my project, I interrogate the ways in which persons can be wronged or harmed in their capacity as knowers, specifically harmed in a discriminatory way. So this refers to instances when one's opinion or ideas are distrusted, for instance, or when someone or a group is excluded from social processes of making sense of things, social deliberation, for instance, not because of what they think, say, or do, but because of their race, their sex, their gender, their class, religion, disability, or other identity markers. So it's a kind of harm at the epistemic level, but particularly drawing on identities. So it's an identity discrimination that is of the epistemic kind. Now we need to distinguish this from the more distributive kind of epistemic injustice when it comes to access to resources or access to information, for instance. That's not what my focus is. My focus is the recognitive type of epistemic injustice, which draws particularly on ideas regarding the way identity consciously or unconsciously, and even institutionally reproduced, in fact, consciously or unconsciously feed into our knowledge making and even knowledge uptake. The way we assent to, or the way we express ideas, how our identities consciously or unconsciously feed into that. And so if you like, my research basically is something that straddles the political aspect, the epistemic aspect, and ethical aspects of human relations and interactions. But so that's the broad anchor of my project. But in terms of the more specific focus of the research, I narrow it down to how epistemic injustice is deployed in philosophy itself. In philosophy in terms of the discipline, but also philosophy as institutionalized. My take on the matter is that institutionalized philosophy reproduces a certain form of epistemic injustice, and this institutional reproduction of epistemic injustice can result to what I then call epistemic paralysis. My central question, therefore, would be, what are the unexamined assumptions in philosophy that contribute towards making and reproducing a kind of society that is discriminatory, subjugating, and repressive? So, if you like, it's almost counter argumentative to the way we usually think of philosophy as something that frees us or liberates us. Here, I'm making the assumption that there is an aspect of philosophy that, if we're not alert to, could actually be reproducing a subjugating kind of society. So the connecting research problem, therefore, would be, how are we to reconstruct philosophy such that it is enabling and empowering instead of discriminatory, subjugating, and repressive? So in addressing these questions, I introduce and develop the concept of epistemic paralysis, or what I generally refer to as being paralyzed as a knower, when there is a disconnection between what you know and what is the received understanding. That's one type that I am trying to conceptualize. That's one type of epistemic paralysis. And when there's that dissonance between your intimated sense of a given experience and your received understanding, or the dominant knowledges that are distributed, for instance, it can knock off your faith in terms of your faith in your own epistemic abilities or your own agencies. So, for instance, an example, just to give you an idea, would be when a woman of color immersing herself into these philosophical texts, say Enlightenment period, that sees philosophy as primarily a Western enterprise, as a Western discipline. And all the texts that you've been reading as well were written by men, but also that in the narratives of these philosophical texts, women are portrayed to be emotional, their feminine character sort of, this is ancient philosophy now, in the ancient philosophers' words, for instance, it clouds your judgment. Emotions cloud your judgment, and being feminine is usually related to being emotional. And so these narratives, when internalized, can not necessarily, but it can lead to some form of epistemic self-mistrust or distrust, if you like. And so you may be led to thinking that, well, philosophy, I'll never be able, as a woman of color, you'll never be able to match the philosophical prowess of men, and particularly white men at that, Western thinkers. But even further than the individual level, it can spill over into your epistemic relations with other epistemic agents who share your identity. And that's when it becomes even more problematic, because it's not only the case that you can be inhibited to participate in the discourse because you think whatever you'll be able to think about will be inferior to white men's discussions of philosophy, but that when your fellow women of color, for instance, will begin to raise their ideas, you may have internalized that sense of discrimination against that identity, and therefore you would be reproducing as well this injustice or this type of inhibition or paralysis as I am sketching. So basically, I use the concept of epistemic paralysis to refer to the condition of being externally, so by other external forces, or internally inhibited from airing an opinion, contributing to discourse, developing ideas and knowledges or knowledge resources, for instance, as a result of the experience of identity-based marginalization at the epistemic level. So my focus basically is in philosophy, how that happens in philosophy, but my aim is, at least in the larger scheme of things, by narrowing down to philosophy first, I might be able to find a framework from which to diagnose other other epistemic institutions in the long run, say in science, for instance, how science might also be unconsciously reproducing epistemic injustice, or how governments, how academic institutions in general will be reproducing this. For instance, our preference for Western texts, Western knowledges that get feed into our curriculum at the expense of local knowledge that we need anyway in order for us to be alert to the problems of our nations, for instance, or our local communities, which gets downplayed when there's an imbalance in the resources that we develop and immerse ourselves into. If that somehow captures it.
Yeah, I'm sure I'll be able to discuss or substantiate later your research problem. But let me focus on one thing which I noticed or got from your discussion a while ago, because I cannot help but notice that your dissertation, epistemic injustice, hits close to home. And home here specifically refers to philosophy as a discipline and philosophy as an institution. Now, my question is therefore your choice of topic or problem motivated or influenced by a personal experience you had in the past in philosophy as a discipline and the philosophical institution? Did you, in other words, experience this form of epistemic injustice, which therefore inspires you now to write about it in your dissertation?
Yes, I think that's an excellent question, and I really like that question as well.
Yeah.
Maybe I can premise my response by explaining a little bit of why I pursued philosophy, or why I pursued PhD at all, and research on epistemic injustice particularly.
Yes.
I have always been, since undergrad, I've always been attentive. I'm drawn to thinking about philosophy itself as a practice, but also as an institution. So when I was thinking about my PhD work, and I think this is reflected too in my undergrad thesis on Heidegger and my master's thesis in Baguio, I wanted really to meaningfully contribute to the growth and development of philosophy in the Philippines, but at a larger landscape in non-Western philosophical institutions. My aim is to challenge, as a scholar, the canons of philosophy that foster a repressive society. And just taking off from what you said there earlier, while thinking about this, I gradually look back into my experience as an undergraduate student and identified the challenges that I had to go through as I was studying philosophy. And then it hit me that I've not always been I don't consider myself as someone who had always been very good in philosophy, for instance. And there were very, if you like, there were very singular experiences that when I started articulating them, I realized that other students of philosophy share the same problems or challenges or experiences. And I thought, why not capitalize on those experiences such that when I am writing my dissertation, I'm not only contributing to knowledge itself, but I'm contributing to the transformation of society through research. So that's one of, I suppose, if you like, that's one of my more organic disposition as a student in general. And I want that, or I use that and channeled it to philosophy. Because as a person too, I've noticed that when I am writing, I cannot write if I'm not excited about the topic I'm writing about. So I always try to find that X factor in an idea, which is usually very difficult to find.
Yeah.
But the only way I'm able to find it is to really introspectively reflect upon what have I been paying attention to, as opposed to simply what am I interested in, because interest can
Mm.
be trivialized, if you like. But when I read the text, when I listen to a thinker, when I reflect upon the ideas that came to me during the courses I took in my undergrad and master's, what is that question, or what are those questions? Because there's so many questions usually. What are those questions that I have been paying attention to that always catches my attention unintentionally? So when it comes to identifying the problem, one of the things to bear in mind is it requires a lot of self-knowledge, if you like.
Yes.
You really need to be honest with yourself, and you really need to sit down and review how you have been receiving, or how receptive you have been to certain ideas. And so going back to what I've mentioned earlier, if I'm not excited, I don't really excel in what I write. And this manifests, for instance, in courses wherein if I cannot find that X factor, I usually do not do well in that course because I'm just doing it out of requirement.
Yeah.
And I thought that if there's one discipline that really relates to life and to passion, to 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 something so close to the way you think every day, I think that would be philosophy, and yeah, I suppose other humanities subjects and social sciences. But philosophy has this particular commitment or claim that it is drawn from the the it's drawn from life in general. Maybe just an anecdote. It's interesting that Alain Badiou once wrote about the paradoxical relationship of life and philosophy, because on the one hand we do say philosophy is about life, but when you read philosophy, it's like it's in formulas and it's in using jargons, and it doesn't resemble anything about life. And yeah, that's just interesting, I thought. But yeah, I thought that it will be a waste of my time if I am not able to identify a problem that concerns me at an existential level, and which I can use precisely for my research. So if you like, it's more of, I really want to research this. That's why I did
Yeah.
philosophy or PhD,
Mm.
as opposed to, okay, I'm doing a degree and therefore I need to find a research problem. it's kind of the reverse. If that makes sense at all.
I like your distinction, the distinction you introduced between interest and what you are paying attention to, because I think this is one important insight for our students, especially that they are trying now to formulate and choose the problem they wanted to dedicate their bachelor's thesis into, right? And I agree with this particular distinction between something you are just interested in and something you are paying attention to. And this reminds me specifically of a philosopher, Simone Weil, who in her book, Waiting for God, said that studying to a certain extent is just paying attention to. Right? You pay attention to the world, right? You comport to the world. And in that comportment, right, you discover something about it that is of insight to you and to your life and to the world in general. Right? So magandang tip yun from Ma'am Kelly that in choosing your research problem, do not just settle on your interests, which might be many things, but focus on what you are paying attention to, at what you deeply cares as a human being. The other one that I got or picked up from your research is this notion that your research problem or the end result of your research problem should in the end explain the world to you rather than replace it with something else. Kasi yung sinasabi mo kanina, you want philosophy to make sense of your experience rather than to replace it with something that is unrecognizable. At yung replace ng philosophy yung problem mo with some formula or whatnot. And again, this reminds me of the philosopher Blaise Pascal, who said that philosophers have declared the death of God, but really what they have declared is the death of the philosopher's God, not really the God of Abraham, Jacob, and Israel, of Isaac. And so it doesn't really touch human experience, and doesn't really explain or make sense of human experience, which is your starting point as a researcher. Now, my next question, Kelly, is that did you ever think that this closeness to the problem you are working on became a hindrance to you thinking about it? Because as you said, it's very close to experience. But did it ever occur to you that this closeness might blind you into arriving at the end towards a insight?
That's another excellent question. I wouldn't say it's a disadvantage. I'm a self-declared idealist and optimist, for better or worse. But I like to think that, I'm not sure if it was Einstein or, well, some famous scientist that I forgot now, who said that when you encounter, and I'm paraphrasing, when you encounter difficulties, look at it as a challenge rather than an obstruction, or it's like a challenge to be better, to get out of your comfort zone. So if I find that it may be more difficult because I feel so invested into the topic, I see that as a way to improve my own habits of thinking, as well as to counter check the way I formulate ideas, the way I develop them, counter check it with what has been written, with the feedback from people through seminars, conferences. That's why you deliver papers in philosophy.
Yeah.
You need that feedback. You need that social process of sense making to see whether you are whether what you say is only subjective to you, or is it something that can be argued at a more general or social academic level. And that's when colleagues, that's when your supervisor or advisor, as we call it, come into the picture. Again, what we're talking about here is a research. And when we talk about research, it involves a community. I think that's one of the things that I really appreciated in social epistemology in particular. This attentiveness to the social dimension, communal dimension of knowledge making or resource generation, resource development. You do not underestimate the value of a community, of a society, an epistemic community, for instance, an academic community. Do not underestimate the value of that, because that is the only way you can see whether what you are saying is something that can contribute to the discourse, or whether it is something that may have been narrowly viewed, constructed, or developed. So I'm not sure if that answers the question, but yeah, basically, first, I don't think that it's a problem if it makes things more difficult. Rather, if it makes things more difficult, I see that as a challenge to become better. Second, getting too invested such that you become insensitive to other views, or you may be putting into very narrow or subjective ideas. The response to that is rely on the philosophical community, rely on your supervisors to point out to you those limitations. That way you contribute to the discourse because you have something unique to say, but also you allow your views to be counter-checked by the community. That's why you present papers, that's why you publish, that's why you get interviewed like this, for instance. Yeah, that's why you write papers, basically.
Yeah. Let us dig deeper on that particular area of the closeness of your problem to your experience or what you care about. Right? Because I think we need to recognize, as you said, that your experience, what you care about is one thing. Research, the output is another thing, right? Your experience is governed by different norms, how you articulate it, in the same way that research is governed by a set of norms, right? Institutionalized norms in research. So my question would be, how do you move from talking about what you care about, your experience, towards developing a research problem that would be that would conform to the norms of research? So what's the process? What do you immediately do after you've realized that you really care about this particular problem and you wanted to dedicate your, I don't know, 1 year, 2 years of writing the thesis to this particular problem? But that's not enough, right? You need to recognize that there's process of translating that particular experience to something that would be judged worthy of a bachelor's thesis or a degree. So anong ginagawa mo, ma'am, pag ganon, yung process of translating it into a research problem?
Yes, I have a very easy answer to that.
Yeah.
Once you identified what you pay attention to, then read.
Yeah.
Because that's what we do in philosophy. We read. We don't have fieldwork. Our fieldwork is reading itself. So when you have identified the question, well, it's usually the question is creative. It changes as you write, as you read more. But when you identify that first step And be very conscious to admit to yourself that in the beginning, your problem will not be solid just yet. That's why you need to read. That's why you need to present it. That's why you need the feedback of your supervisor. So in reading, that's when you become immersed to the different ways in which philosophers or thinkers have formulated that similar question. That's one of the things that is interesting in a research. On the one hand, you need to identify something that concerns thinkers, human beings, almost universally. But at the same time, it has to be a kind of problem, and that's where the academic dimension comes into play. It has to be a problem or a question that contributes something unique to the discussion. Because otherwise you'll just be repeating it, and then there's no point. You don't advance knowledge that way if you're simply repeating it. Unless, of course, you're repeating it in the sense that you're reinterpreting it, then you're contributing something. But what I'm trying to say is, in philosophy at least, you will have to identify that almost universal question that you think any thinking individual would be able to think about anyway. The question of injustice, the question of the good life, the question of whether we can improve science or not. Is science the best way to understand reality, for instance? Is being human something that we must commit to, or is going beyond the human, post-humanism, for instance, something that we can entertain, like living with AIs, living with robots, for instance, as well. So that every philosophical question, I'm taking off from Alain Badiou, who has inspired me a lot, but I am also criticizing now in my PhD because of his Western-oriented view of philosophy. But he said that philosophy has a universal address. It addresses people universally. So that's the closeness to your heart part, close to humanity part. Then the academic dimension is now by reading into the different ways in which philosophers address the problem. So you'll have response A. So this question, for instance, my question again is, in what way has philosophy reproduced a subjugating kind of society? We have responses from social epistemology, responses from critical theory, responses from feminist philosophy, responses from decolonial and post-colonial studies. You have responses from philosophies of disability. And so you have A, B, C, D, and E to A to Z responses. And now you have to identify which of them go together, which of them are in contradiction with one another, and then identify the gap.
Yeah.
So in the academic dimension of it, as you try to distance, but I'd say rather than creating a distance between your problem and you, I'd say as you go deeper instead.
Yeah.
Because you're going
or even
deeper
refine it, right?
Yeah. By research, as you go deeper into it, you will eventually be led to identifying what we know about it, what we know already, what has been written. And only through reading, through listening, through paying attention to questions and problems, do you arrive at the point of what is missing. So, what are the knowledge gaps? And focus on just one, because that's the realistic thing to do. And again, that's why it's so exciting to belong to a community, because you could be responding to the similar question but from different approaches, and then you let one another build that resource that gives you a handle on how to properly approach the question. But you are contributing, albeit so small academically, you're contributing to the discussion, and your small contribution will result to a more nuanced and a more developed approach to the subject matter or the problem. Yeah, maybe you can help me.
Yeah, I like
expand that further.
your idea of formulating a research problem, right? Because we are still discussing this stage of research where you're formulating a research problem. And what I got from your discussion, and what I also subscribe to, is the fact that when you raise a research problem, the research problem must be formulated in a appropriate way. In other words, you must raise the right question in the context of your discipline, right? Because it's your discipline that would judge whether the question that you raise is the right question, right? And I cannot emphasize this enough, right? My professors in undergraduate in graduate school always tells me or tells us that raising the right question is already halfway through the right answer. The first battle is to raise the correct question at all and in the first place. And only after you've raised the correct question that you would expect or hope for a correct answer, or at least an insightful answer to your question. And it seems to me that raising the correct question already requires so much on the part of the researcher. As you mentioned a while ago, you need to read, you need to immerse yourself into the literature. And that's the process involved in raising the correct question. Right? That's why I always say to my students that the literature review does not only happen after you've raised the question. As a matter of fact, the problem itself is already a product of a literature review, right? In the sense of, formulating your research problem in the context of the knowledge gaps that you've identified, in the context of your discipline. So I don't know if this is being too demanding to, to our students, but I always say that there's always two literature review. One involved in raising the correct question, the other in finding ways to answer that question you've raised, hopefully correctly. That's the second one. And yun yung usually na may emphasis Yun yung may chapter sa research, yung literature review. But usually yung literature review kasi na chapter 2 usually ng mga research just now focus on what are the things that have been said to answer this particular question. But no discussion of how the literature leads to that kind of problem you are raising in the first place. And I think that's important in developing, formulating a research problem. But enough of my views. Since we're already talking about the research problem, about the literature review, I think we could now go to the questions that directly relates to the literature review. Can you share with us how did you write your literature review? And more specifically, what's your view of what is a literature review? What is its function? Is it just a mere, aggregate of results, or is it doing something more?
Yeah, this is one of the things that I've always had. I myself had always difficulty trying to understand the nature of it. And lately, I realized that the reason why I couldn't understand or appreciate the value of literature review is because it was portrayed to be something separate from what I am actually already writing.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I'm going, my view, and other scholars might disagree with me, but I think what my appreciation of a literature review is basically the identification of the sources that you are going to use, the sources that, as you have said, have helped you formulate the problem, and the sources that have helped you identify the responses to the problem. It is a review because on the one hand, so what are the basic parts of it. You provide an overview, a basic summary of what it is about, and then how it relates to the question you are raising. But then you have to identify, you have to evaluate how convincing, how effective, how comprehensive were these responses or ways of formulating the problem were in relation to the question you are asking. So if you like, research problem and literature review are so tied together.
Yeah.
It's almost impossible to tear them apart, because as I've said earlier, writing is a creative process. You don't have formulated everything in your head already and then you begin writing. It's almost like what, again, quoting, referring to Badiou, it's almost like the double event. The first event is when you have identified that universal question that always bothers you, for instance. It's like, why is it the case that after all the philosophies written, after all political science texts, for instance, social science texts that aims to address the pathologies of society, it's still a very crappy world. Something as fundamental as that could be something that you've always been paying attention to. So that's your first event. But you need the second event. And you can arrive at that creatively, dynamically, as you read through the texts. Again, you began with something that's close to home, you began with something more universal, and you narrow it down as you read the texts. And that's when you're reading, you have to identify the sources that helped you, and that's what you will include in the literature review. What sources helped you formulate or understand this problem? What sources helped you identify the responses, or what sources respond to, rather, to this problem? And then evaluate how effective were they in helping you understand, and how effective were they in responding to the question you were raising. And then the double event is when you identify what is missing. That's the academic part of it. That's the specific dimension to it. So in relation to this big universal fundamental question of philosophy of life in general, what is that more academic question that you are now asking? That particular question that contributes a little bit to that universal question. And so in my case, for instance, coming off from that very general question about why is it that despite having read so many philosophical texts on how to live the good life, how to create the best society, I don't see the society as progressive enough, for instance. And so my specific research, my specific academic question in relation to that big question is, how does philosophy help reproduce subjugating kind of society? The maybe philosophy is not doing its job properly. Maybe there's something missing. And so that would be my second event, my second problem. And what happens in between that, the texts I have consulted, sometimes it's exciting when the question is a live question, when a lot of scholars at the moment are if you like, almost competing with you in trying to identify the best answer or best approach to the matter. It becomes even more exciting. But you may not always have that. You could be focusing on a question that has been studied in the past, but you think that it's insufficient, it's unconvincing, there's something more, there's something missing, given historical situation, given your other learnings now that they didn't have in the past, for instance. So you need to capitalize on what exists, and then Yeah, and then identify what you think is the gap in there, and use that knowledge of the gap to articulate why you think these sources have not touched upon that, or have to articulate your argument on why they are ineffective, unconvincing, or one part of their response is convincing, but the other part doesn't sit in well with how you think things are. So yeah, what do you write in the literature review? You write the literature you have consulted. You write the literature that will help you build your response to the problem that you have formulated. If that makes sense at all. So it's not a separate thing from what you're actually already doing. The problem, I suppose, is, so are you not simply repeating then what you're going to write in the chapters and what you're going to write in the specific literature review? I think that's the more practical question part of it, if you understand literature review in terms of what the sources that you actually used. You will be repeating, but in the literature review, you approach it from a bird's eye view. In the data chapters, as we say, or in the discussion part of the body, you're focusing on their very specific ideas. But in the literature review, it's more of a bird's eye view, overview of the work, how it responds to the problem, and your evaluation of how effective it is in responding to the problem.
Yeah. Would you therefore agree with me, because this is my view about the literature review, would you therefore agree with me that partly a literature review has the function of being justificatory and legitimating your question? In other words, a literature review secures you two things, or is supposed to secure you two things. You secure your right to raise the question at all, and your right to answer it in a particular way. And therefore, the literature review is not just purely descriptive, and merong dapat justificatory and legitimating part of the literature review. Would you agree with that view, or do you think it's too strong?
No, I haven't thought of it that way, but I think you're right in your articulation in terms of that justificatory element. If I'm going to relate that to what I've said earlier, I think that's the word for what I was describing regarding your contribution to the discourse. You can only say that this is what I contribute if you have done your work in researching on what has already been said. And that's usually a time consuming, but that's why you call it a research in the first place.
Yeah.
You need to know what others have already said, and yeah, that's the academic demand. Why should anybody listen to you at all?
Yeah.
So if we formulate that in terms of justification of your right to pursue the problem and your right to defend that argument, your unique place in the discussion, then yeah, I would agree. I would totally agree with it.
Yeah, I'm raising this precisely because students seem to have a difficulty in trying to write a coherent literature review, coherent in a sense that it's not just a collection of, of things, articles reviewed, but there's a unifying thread in that particular literature review. And my sense is that one way to make a coherent literature review is to forward a justificatory line of reasoning using precisely the articles you've consulted in arriving at your particular problem. Anyway, yeah, thank you for that answer. I still have so many questions prepared for you, Kelly, but I think it's time for us to entertain questions from the audience since it's
All right.
already nearing 5 o'clock. So let's pick some questions from the Q&A box. Right. So here's a question from Ma'am Nella. Congratulations to both of you. I like the exchange. In history, when sources become a problem, we abandon the research question. Does this problem have a counterpart in philosophy? Thank you, Kelly.
That's very interesting. I think I'd like to know what happens when we say that sources have a problem. I'm not sure entirely if we do that in philosophy, most especially because, as I have articulated, my appreciation, at least, of philosophical problems is, and this is inspired by Dr. Julius Mendoza, we're all beginners always in the question of philosophy. And usually these philosophical questions are questions that can arise to any thinking individual. Now, again, of course, I'm only talking about the universal fundamental question. And so that way, I won't say we have that counterpart when it comes to the universal fundamental question, because the reason why we call them fundamental is they never go away. To use Kant's words in his critique of pure reason, these are the questions that arise through reason, but reason seems to be incapable of fully exhausting the answer. But for instance, the second type of question, the more academic, the more research and more specific question, I think it's rather than the problem, it's the responses to the problem that we abandon or criticize and say that's moot, that we have solved that already. Although sometimes it's so weird that a question that you think has already been solved, again, because we're talking about reasoning as opposed to empirical evidences, for instance. Because we're talking about reasoning, it takes sometimes a genius to identify that we have been wrong in seeing that problem to be something that has already been solved. So my intuition, I have to get back to this question eventually in my later years, maybe. But my direct response, my intuitive response to that is, I don't think that it's possible to fully abandon a problem in philosophy if we commit to the assumption that philosophical problems are fundamental to human existence.
Yeah. I think the context of Mom Nella's question, Kelly, is the problem in history where you don't have a primary source. For example, you're interested in a historical problem about pre-16th century or pre-colonial period, wherein we don't have much written primary sources, but rather we have archaeological sources, but not so much on written primary sources. I might be wrong, but I think that's the context of Ma'am Nella's question. And that therefore, if they don't have the primary sources, they couldn't have a way of answering the historical problem. The historical problem they are raising about pre-16th century or the pre-colonial period. That's why I think Ma'am Nella said that they usually abandon the problem for the lack of primary sources. And I don't know if there's an analog of that particular problem in history. And what I could think of is the question of originality, the originality of the philosophical problem, such that there has been no philosopher in the past who talked about it. And therefore, could you raise, or should you even raise an original problem in that pure sense of an original problem? Or do you always need to go back to the existing philosophical conversations that has already happened in the past. So what do you think about the question of originality, or perhaps more appropriately, the question of novelty?
Yeah, I now appreciate it more or understand it more. And my response to that is something similar perhaps to the answer of Kuhn when he was thinking about the nature of the scientific problem. And he thinks that a scientific problem, for instance, is like a puzzle. It's just your mind that's your enemy, basically. It's either you're just too stupid to be able to respond to the problem, or you're able to figure out the puzzle. The difference is we don't have a single response to the philosophical questions. But I think that when you identify a question, and for instance, for some reason it has never been raised before, say because again, life is historical, questions are historically formulated, and there could be social, cultural, historical circumstances that are present now but were not there in the past and gave rise to these questions. The question of technology, for instance, that would have not occurred in ancient medieval times, for instance, because they didn't have internet yet before. So these questions are specific or historically contingent, if you like. Contingent, but not accidental. Those are two different things too. They're historically contingent, and therefore you can raise the question in an original manner, and it's very likely too that they may not have been sources written on that. So what do you do then? We're saying that, so what are you going to write on your literature review in the first place? You can write in your literature review that no sources has been identified there yet. But then that makes it an even more difficult challenge, because then you really have to be that kind of philosopher who develops the question, develops concepts, develops the problem. Yeah. Althusser is one of those thinkers who thought of philosophy as primarily a construction of a problem. You actually create a problem. Like philosophers create problems. They create questions.
They create concepts, right? According to Deleuze and Guattari.
Yeah, Deleuze and Guattari, on the other hand, think that philosophy create concepts instead of problems. So in my case, for instance, in my PhD, I am developing the concept of epistemic paralysis. That concept has not been viewed before. And I think that there were different ways, albeit marginally, ways in which philosophers from decolonial philosophy, feminist philosophy, ableist criticism against ableism, for instance, classism, they have approached the question of paralysis marginally, but have not really delved into the question of how you can be inhibited as a knower, as a thinker, to participate in a discourse. And therefore, even if, as Habermas would say, even if you have guaranteed the preconditions for communication, for instance, that you're not being coerced, that you're not being deceived, that everybody has communicative rights. And what was the other one? There's one more precondition for communication. Even if you have guaranteed them, if you as an agent was involved in that community, you're not excluded at all. Everybody would like to listen to you. But if you don't feel agential, you think that your views are not worthy of being aired because of an internalized distrust on your own views, then you can still have a systematically distorted communication. And therefore, you do not arrive at that better argument that deserves rational deliberation, for instance. So I have digressed now, but so in my case, for instance, I feel, or I think, and I have confirmed that with scholars, by presentation, by publishing, by coordinating with my supervisor, that it's a novel question because it asks precisely what will happen when you are inhibited from participating in knowledge generation. And this is why I draw on critical social theory, because my response basically to that is, first, we need to identify the origin of that inhibition. And I narrow it down to precognitive types of discrimination, for instance. A distorted subject formation because of internalized feelings of inferiority, internalized feelings of self-distrust, feelings of not being able to contribute anything to the discussion, that is intersubjectively produced and institutionally reproduced, can feed into knowledge making, into the sphere of communication. And for that matter, for instance, I don't have exactly the direct responses to my question, but that's when your philosophical lens, your subjective lens, if you like, not subjective in the sense of you're the only one who can think of that, but subjective in the sense that it's from your specific gaze, specific attentiveness or alertness to the question you're responding to, that will be able to pick out those marginal responses and bring them together into productive dialogue, and use that as your literature review then, and use that as a takeoff point for developing, not this as opposed to discovering, but developing a response, a coherent response to your research problem.
I think Ma'am Nella's question is very important because it hints at the distinction between a research problem that is answerable in principle, and on the other hand, a research problem that is answerable in practice. In other words, there are good questions that could be raised, answerable in principle, but it just so happened that you don't have the means yet at the moment to answer that particular problem. That's what I mean by answerable in principle. It's a good question, it's a right question, but you don't have the means yet to answer the particular question. And as opposed to answerable in practice, meaning it's a good question, and at the same time, you know how to answer it. Right? And I think that distinction is important to emphasize especially in undergraduate research, that you need to take into account that you don't only raise a good question, a right question, but a question that is answerable in practice, meaning answerable in the range of possible sources you have, in the capacities and the technologies available to us at a particular moment. Mahirap kasi yung mga answerable in principle lang. It's a good question, but you don't yet know how to answer it or where to look for answer in the first place. So yun, magandang distinction yun sa ating mga students today, especially in the pandemic, that they should aim at least for a research problem that should be answerable in the current setting. Maybe not a question that is answerable only in principle. But anyway, enough of my interjections. Let us entertain.
Just a small bit. That's when you need to have a collaborative relationship with your advisor, really, as students, because they will guide you, or because they know the sources. And so they can guide you which kinds of problems will have sources for you. And work together. Rather than thinking that they are your judge, think of them as your guides. And I think that change in disposition will significantly enable or empower you to write. Because I think one of the crimes or vices that we do or we have as undergrads too is to think of our advisors as the judge. And so as much as possible, we don't want to see them, or we don't want to subject our very poorly written work to their judgment. Well, of course, they will grade you in the long run, but think of them as your guides, as people who might be able to direct you to the right sources. So always communicate, have that very good communication channel.
Let's go to the question of Sir Adonis. So the question is a curious question though. How have your ideas changed since you started your dissertation project? What ideas or processes in the research have you refined and or discarded? It's a question of change in the research.
Right. Yeah, as again, as I've mentioned, it's really a creative process, writing itself. When I proposed my problem, I was only focusing on Filipino philosophy actually, and how we might be committing epistemic injustice in philosophical institution in the Philippines. And so my very raw title back then was just epistemic injustice and philosophy. And then for my network and my connection, I Professor Marela Bolaños and Darlene Demandante have invited me to contribute to the critique issue on women doing philosophy in the Philippines. And I thought to use that opportunity to force me to write something about my dissertation and also take the opportunity to publish. So, two birds with one stone. As I was writing Epistemic Injustice, I'm trying to explain it in my writing what epistemic injustice is. That's when I arrived at the understanding of epistemic paralysis. I can still clearly remember at that moment when I was trying to explain hermeneutic injustice in particular, wherein Miranda Fricker describes how your faith in your own epistemic agency can be knocked off when there is a dissonance between your received understanding and your intimated sense of a given experience. I thought that I have underwent that type of experience, and I tried to give a name to that experience, because naming gives you a synthetic tool for bringing together different types of experiences. When I named epistemic paralysis, and then, well, I was able to write the paper and submitted it to my dissertation supervisor, she thought that it was brilliant. And so from then on, so that would be the event in my writing. From then on, I tried to pay attention to how the different texts I'm reading on epistemic injustice, on critical social theory, were able or not able to identify this dimension of the injustice, that part of inhibition of epistemic agency that I think affects most specifically students in philosophy in non-Western institutions, but I think it affects philosophy at large as well. And so as the years or the months progress, my knowledge of it keeps on developing, also depending on the feedback I get from delivering my papers. And so in terms of the significant change, that's the main change. From a simple discussion on epistemic injustice and philosophy and focus on Filipino philosophy, I shifted to developing the concept of epistemic paralysis instead. Still a little in relation to that original question, but then the more micro changes happened as I received feedback and as I tried to conceptualize the idea itself.
Here's another question, Madam Kelly. A bit personal. From someone sent me a question. Do you also experience imposter syndrome? How do you deal with it?
Yeah. Yes. And sometimes, or even now, I still have difficulty trying to identify it as imposter syndrome. I sometimes just think that I'm not good enough. And my objective basis for that is when I read an article, when I read a text, it's like, oh my God, they have thought of everything that I could
Yeah.
imagine. Or just last night, for instance, I was trying to write my chapter on epistemic paralysis and epistemic agency. And then because there's going to be a workshop, and this is a modest plug, there's going to be a workshop in May, first week of May, on epistemic injustice and recognition theory. I'm going to be presenting with two of our professors and one postdoctoral student researcher in UCD. And I've discovered that there's a volume in Feminist Quarterly on precisely that topic, epistemic injustice and the theory of recognition. And I didn't have any clue. And I've been reading on this problem for what? For 2 years now. And I've only discovered it now. So discoveries like those um, can sometimes make you think whether at all you're contributing anything significant to the
Yeah.
discussion. But again, that's why you need to read. Because at face value, it may look like they have already said everything else. But if you pay close attention to what is missing and capitalize on your experiences in a phenomenological way, if you like, capitalize on your experiences, at least I hope, because that's what happened to me. I hope that you will still be able to find that unique angle from which you can bring something to the discussion. So that's one way. How do I deal with imposter syndrome? Have I experienced it? Yes. How do I deal with it? I read. I need an objective basis whether I'm good enough, or I need an objective basis whether I can contribute something to the discourse. Another practical way is sometimes it gets very difficult in academic work because a lot of the work done are not seen, most especially in the pandemic context. So you don't have that more social or objective basis from which to determine whether you are doing something at all. Say, can you write in your progress report, for instance, that, okay, I've read this much books? Maybe not. But try to make a list of maybe how many pages have you read? As simple as that. How many books have you read, articles you have read for a certain amount of time? What were the list your activities? What were the things you were able to do? And when it hits you, that imposter syndrome, when it hits you, try to go back to that list of the things you were able to do, even if it's just a document for your own for your own. You don't have to publish it or distribute it to people, but just having that material proof for you, material proof that you have done something, can bring back that sense of faith that you can do something, or you were able to do something actually. And again, I couldn't emphasize it enough. So that would be how many things have I listed already? 2. That will be the third one. That's when the community, the academic or epistemic community, becomes very valuable. You need that social recognition that you're someone who's capable of contributing something, that you're not a writing machine as well, and your supervisor should be your main anchor, in fact, in identifying, or your main anchor in having that sense of what you are doing, what have you done, what else can you do. And if you focus on that, that imposter syndrome may still be underlying on the side, but it won't be the highlight of your attentiveness or your attention rather. Yeah. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. Can I say something also about the imposter syndrome? Because of course, I think most of us would experience it at some point.
Yeah.
But my concern always is the judgment itself. How do you arrive at the judgment that you are not good enough? Because I think that's a heavy judgment. It's a
Right.
judgment about your being itself. And I think that those kinds of judgment must be must be based on some relevant basis. And the basis should not just be what you are at some particular point in time. What you are at some particular point in time should not be used as a basis for a total judgment about what you are as a human being. That's why I'm very concerned about judgments like this about what you are or who you are as a researcher, right? Because I think that you must not identify who you are or what you are at a particular point only of your life.
Yeah.
Because that's a heavy judgment about your being. So
I like
I
that.
guess my point is we need also to be reflective and discern more have more discernment about the basis of our judgments and the kind of judgments that we draw from certain evidences of our in our life.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I just realized that imposter syndrome is like one of the modalities in which we could be epistemically paralyzed as well.
yeah,
When, yeah, when you lose that sense of trust in your epistemic agency, that's what I call paralysis. And so the aim really of my dissertation too is what are the social as well as individual and institutional ways in which we can activate that agency. So how do we overcome imposter syndrome as a modality of epistemic paralysis? So
here's I
watch out.
think yeah. I think this will be the last question for our dialogue,
Yeah.
ma'am. The problem of epistemic injustice seems to involve concepts from other disciplines, like
Yeah.
notions of institutions and discrimination. Can you give advice in doing a research, philosophical research that involves focus or frame from a specific discipline, but incorporates insights from other disciplines without losing focus in the home discipline? I hope you
I
got the
like
question, ma'am.
yeah, I like that question particularly because that's what I am doing really in my research. It is a philosophical question because um, again, my question is in what way philosophy reproduces subjugating kind of society. It's a philosophical question because it's a question about what or in what way do concepts reproduce a subjugating type of society in the first place. But I need to draw resources from, say, psychoanalysis. I need to draw resources from certain aspects of psychology, draw resources from sociology as well, the sociology of knowledge, as well as critical social theory. And how do I not lose focus on the philosophical question? As we have begun this conversation, your question must be philosophical in the first place. And even if you're dealing with empirical sources, even if you're dealing with sources from other disciplines, the aim is to use this data, to use these texts to answer that philosophical question. So, what makes a research philosophical? The question itself. So that would be my, I suppose, my easy answer. I'm not sure if it's a convincing answer, but that's how you not lose focus on your discipline. So if your work is in sociology or in psychology, how do you ascertain that the question is a psychology question or a sociology question, even if you're drawing ideas from philosophy or from, say, biology, for instance, apart from simply consulting texts in your discipline? Because these texts were not immediately right away philosophical, for instance. They became philosophical because they were responding to a philosophical question. So that would be my point of view on that.
Thank you, Ma'am Kelly, for that answer and your answer to all the questions that we've asked this afternoon. So as much as we want to not let go of Kelly this afternoon because of her invaluable insights, I'm afraid that we have to stop the dialogue at this point since we no longer have time. Of course, discussion would go on. And so I'm therefore saying that we can end the discussion now, and thank you for attending our digital dialogue. But before we let you go, this just to remind you to answer our feedback form, which I type in our chat box, right? So please help us determine our weaknesses so that we could improve for the next webinars and lectures. And also, we wanted to announce the next series or the next session of this digital dialogue, which will happen on April 19, on Monday next week, about the notions of justice in the Cordillera, the purpose of punishment, with Professors Alejandro Sencia and Roel Caricativo. Right? So we hope again to see you or to join us again next on Monday for this particular digital dialogue. Right? So thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, Vlad.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sir Vlad, okay na po?
Sige po, sir. Thank you.
Okay po. Thank you po. See you next week.